Hi, today we're looking at part 4 of Spinoza's Ethics, and in particular, this part of the Ethics looks at virtue and the life of servitude. It is called Of Human Servitude, also translated bondage, or of the strength or the power, potenza, of the emotions or affects. So, human servitude is the weakness of human emotions or of the affects. And so, when he speaks of the strength of emotions or the power of them, this is their power to act and thus to escape from servitude. And as we're going to see, he demonstrates this through his concept of the conatus and tries to deduce everything from the notion that the conatus, insofar as it can form adequate ideas, is our escape velocity. It's how we get out of bondage. And for this reason, these views are often thought as a kind of mix of hedonism and stoicism, or at least aspects of each of these ancient philosophies. Hedonism, because we must continue to gratify our desire in order to endure in existing. So virtue will not be the renunciation of self-care or self-love, but rather will be the ability to habituate ourselves to different desires, different emotions, and find new standards of satisfaction. And this ordering of the affects to our highest satisfaction is not the mind dominating the body, and it is also not the eradication of emotions. And in the appendix to part 4, section 27, he says, the more ways the body is capable of being affected by external bodies, the more ways it is capable of affecting external bodies, then the more capable the mind is of thinking. We'll come back to this quote later in the lecture and look at it in more detail through all of the related propositions and even those postulates and lemata in part 2 of the Ethics. But it will be important to track how the body and the mind work together in tandem, but also differently, in order for our ethical transformation to take place that this chapter is outlining. And essentially, Spinoza is arguing that the philosophical life is the only one that can reliably, and we might even say that can necessarily secure our happiness and contentment. And he'll also be showing how a life without philosophical community, without others to learn from and be working in fellowship with, such a life is always going to be subjected to the sway of fortune, emotions, and ultimately we will suffer from the disempowering activity of envious and cruel people who are driven only by greed, superstition, or bigotry. Our servitude is the result of our inability to organize with other people, and it's prolonged and preserved. We are in this state because of our antisocial affects like envy. Envy makes us happy when someone else suffers and sad when someone else is happy. We need to all be happy and sad together through concerted activity. But that doesn't mean homogenization, it means that we work in fellowship. Our natures agree, that doesn't mean we're identical, but rather a willful cohesion that is not coercion, which arises from the cultivation of virtue. And part 4 tracks this process of overcoming unhealthy and antisocial emotions. We must form a sense of our own self-dignity. We must value our own self-worth. And thereby, we actually resolve to improve ourselves. This is the first virtue. It is the idea of the conatus, if you will. It is the awareness of one's power and the affordances by which one is facilitated to renew and enrich that power. So it's the pure affirmation of our essence as actually existing and as formally real. It is this self-expressing free necessity that is on the side of the eternal. It is our joyful self-affirmation of our eternal self. Or that's at least how we can describe it from the perspective of part 5. But in part 4, we see it in the more existential situation of human life. It's the joy of feeling our vitality and the power that vitality not only harbors but increases and expands. Again, the formal reality is the activity itself, the life not in what it, sees and desires and experiences, but in its act of seeing, desiring, experiencing, and we might say the auto-affection of life being affected by its own existence and value. It is the joy of knowing one's own existence is valuable. That one's existence produces value, not only for itself, but for others. And thus, this awareness, again, joyfully increases the power of the kanatos in the self-affirming and in the actual achieving of value by our striving. This is a wellspring of our self-esteem. Spiritedness, the fortitude, the power of spirit, increases its output as it continues and repeats its activity. It draws more from itself than it contains when it organizes affects and when it puts together variety of essences in a way that has ratios of movement and rest in the body, or in a way that agrees in ideas and affects. And this circulates the power of the affects in a way which is empowering. It finds what is coordinating in actions and harmonizing so that they can converge and work collaboratively, right? So that every action doesn't bang against another one and cancel it out, but rather that they push together and that they move in the right way in order to increase and empower each other. And this applies in the body, it applies in one's life, organizing the very movements of their life, and it's essential to forming and preserving a community, a commonwealth. And thus, the question of individual and community is always in tension here. We have aspects of particular self-individuation, and we have aspects of our communal trans-individual, we could say, assembling and composing a multiplicity of individuals without destroying what we could call the constituent power of the individual, which is everything in an individual's power, which even goes beyond the state, or what the state sanctions. Now, as we see in the theological political treatise, the natural right of individuals exists even when they live in a state which denies them those rights. Of course, this can only be up to a certain point. Spinoza points out, you cannot actually remove someone's intellect without destroying them. You cannot make someone not have rational thoughts that they actually have. You can, of course, manipulate people's emotions and make them think things that that aren't true and that they wouldn't believe if they thought about them rationally. So you can control various aspects of life in a very draconian government and make people think whatever you want them to think. And Spinoza even saw this going on in his own time with William III of Orange, who basically used the conservative Calvinist clergy to manufacture consent. We'll come back to this later. And now, before turning more directly to the text and looking at the propositions, I want to give a little brief exposition on what I take to be a fundamental difficulty in reading Spinoza's Ethics. I've referred to this many times. The fact that there's no preface, we are immediately at the beginning of the text getting the fundamental definitions, substance, cause of itself, God, all of these things. And then the reader figures out somewhere along that this really is actually a text about ethics. Well, part 4 is, of course, where that comes clear. And it's in the Scholia and the prefaces and appendices where Spinoza is most candid, where he is most also political and engaged in polemics. So I've been trying to do something strange, which is to write a preface for the Ethics that would be in the spirit and voice of Spinoza in the Scholia and appendices. And the way I'm thinking about this now is even as the preface to the second reading, as if you could have the Ethics as is, but then there would be a second version that you would read after you've read the first one, and it's not going to change any of the axioms, definitions, propositions, and corollaries, but it would change, potentially, the prefaces, appendices, and scholia. Again, this is because the appendices and scholia are commentaries meant to make what is being demonstrated in the definitions and axioms and such more knowable to his audience. It is a way of adapting these ideas to the audience. And thus, we need scholia for adapting it to the audience of someone who's already read the text and already knows what's going on and sees the structure of it. And of course, beyond that, we need introductions and scholia that relate to us, that make the ethics more approachable for us, not people 500 years ago. And I also think that the preface to the second reading would need to account for the fact that some of the things that Spinoza says at the beginning of the Ethics end up panning out differently at the end. I mean, he completely throws out the idea of good and evil, and then in part 4, he brings it back and makes it necessary, or at least useful, to the development of our virtue. And in general, there is a transition from a view of things in duration with reason up to the third kind of knowledge, the intellectual intuition, which is of the essence and is eternal. And of course, there's this vigorous attack against free will, and then a whole doctrine about freedom. So to explain that, and to really give the value-laden claim of the Ethics, I have written the following preface to the second reading. And yeah, I'm dramatizing this a little bit. Look, you're a mode. Calm down. Be more cautious. Many things can destroy you and drain your power. And yet, if you work carefully and grow in your virtues, you could be a pure expression of eternal essence. A mode is finite. It is limited by another of its own kind, and that means it can be destroyed in many ways. As a mode, there are always other modes more powerful that can contradict your existence and destroy you. But you're not just a mode, and while you're not a substance, you are a singular essence. And a singular essence is something that can change and compose itself in many ways. But also, take note that whatever you achieve as a mode by means of your essence, whatever power you yield to create and act, will always depend on the state in which you live, in the community, and the way that others and nature have afforded you these achievements. Also note that actions and joy cannot be explained through finite mechanistic causality of what Descartes understood reason to derive from cutting up reality, and thus neither genuine actions or joy could be understood through what is common to either extension or the mind, considered as attributes in themselves, considered as modes determining each other negatively through transitive causality. Your essence as a singular being involves existence insofar as it is composed joyfully with other essences, forming a new, unique essence, a sui generis essence, with its own perfection, unique to its essence, meaning that it measures itself and determines itself, such that those who live in a community of generosity, in a democratic and philosophical society of free thinkers. The individuals of this society will have a new essence, a new perfection, and a new value, a new sense of value, which is also the standard by which guide and perfect their actions. Individuals living in democratic and free societies come to find a whole new vista of possible actions, possible ways of devoting our effort. They provide us with a new calling, a new vocation, a transvaluation of life, which means, like transformation, transvaluation is a change of value, which is just to say that we come to form a sense of what is worth investing our effort in. This is obvious in the case of practicing a musical instrument. As you proceed in practicing an instrument, once you start to have some success, that's really what's motivating. Once you see that you can do it and that it's fun to do and that you enjoy doing it, that process and learning that action creates a vocation, it creates a calling, it transvalues our life, and it says this is worthy of investing your effort in. And in these kinds of cases, it's obvious that individuals, to some degree, accomplish this through their own self-caused activity, in the sense that no one can practice for you, right? No one can do it for you. You have to put in the effort. Now, of course, having a teacher will make this much easier for most people. You need someone to guide you in your practicing so that you practice it well. But we only manage to learn to play through composing multiplicity, putting this self-affirming activity of the conatus in composition with other conatuses, with other conati. And we can think about this in terms of sympathetic resonance. Sympathetic resonance happens between strings that are either the exact same frequency as each other or some multiple. This is called the harmonic series, but if you double it, triple it, etc., those strings will also have sympathetic resonance with each other. And this isn't just strings, it's, air spaces, columns, like a flute. So basically, when any of these geometrically similar ratios exist in space, let's say it's a string, and you pluck one of these strings, the other string will spontaneously move. It's of course moved by the air between them, but this doesn't happen when the string is out of tune, right? So you take two notes that are a unison, the same string with the same thickness and the same length, under the same tension, produce the same note. And if they're in close proximity with a resonator attached to them and you pluck one, the other one will spontaneously start moving. But if you loosen that note slightly, they do not. Both our individual and our collective affects need to be tuned. We each have our own attunement, our own temperament, and it is through our contrasting temperaments, when we harmonize them and complicate. The more ways that a body is capable of being affected by external bodies, the more ways it is capable of affecting external bodies. And thus, the more the mind is capable of thinking. And of course, a group of people working in fellowship have an even greater number of ways of being affected and a number of ways of affecting external bodies than one person. And thus, the mind of these individuals is more capable of thinking, insofar as they think together in a concerted activity, where their minds push against each other in what doesn't agree and reinforce one another in what does agree. So while you are a mode, and you are finite and fragile, you are also infinite in nature, and you are more than a skin-encapsulated ego subject ever intent on consuming passive pleasures. You are more than a finite, determinate product of some giant machine. You are not a mere negation or reducible to a socio-political context in which you were raised. You are a unique pattern that has individuated through affordances that express diverse powers in many ways. All our power is a participation in the infinite, in the divine power, since we are immediately expressions of God's essence, infinite power of existing in infinite ways. So, insofar as you act and learn how to compose your essence in a concerted activity with others, and insofar as you grow your power and virtue by means of your own power and virtue, you are not only infinite and participating in the infinite immediate mode, you are actually natura naturans. You are like the attributes of God. Every attribute of God is a free necessity, acting through itself, expressing an infinite power. And this is manifest in your cautious, by uncompromisingly pursuing your highest virtue, you not only become way less irritating to everyone, you do not become selfish. Instead, you find that everyone else wants the same thing, wants this same power, wants to cultivate virtue, wants to share the same powers, and wants to empower everyone with what is most empowering, which is what is most reasonable and most useful to humans. This is the intellect. It is naturally generous, according to Spinoza. A reasonable life, cultivating a variety of intellectual faculties, observation, rational discourse, and direct intuition. This person will want to join themselves in fellowship with you. If you find them, they will be generous. And if the circumstances determine that you should have frequent encounters with such people, they will become friends with you and will necessarily devote themselves to working together with you, intellectually collaborating through virtuous friendships leads people to commit themselves to each other and to be committed to preserving a state in which such virtues are developed and fostered. And not only that, but to expand it far beyond anything we can currently imagine. And truly, we can only imagine something so amazing as a world of us working together to compose our minds in the way most agreeable and most empowering. We need to do what we haven't yet learned to do if we want to be happy and have virtue and contentment. But this is not a paradox or a vicious circle. The answer to the human predicament is extremely obvious once you've seen it, once you've intuited its cause and traced out the path of its unfolding. Once we have witnessed what our highest virtue consists of, it becomes hard to understand how anyone can live a life different from that virtue, from that pious and generous life. Once we have tasted virtue, we see that it's the only life that necessarily can include contentment. The reason that the obviousness of the meaning of life, you might say, is so readily missed is that our abjection and our weakness, abjection for Spinoza is the knowledge or consciousness of our weakness. It's the sad affect that accompanies our awareness of our weakness. These emotions mutilate our minds and give us patterns of antisocial affects like envy. And yet we have all experienced within ourselves some sense that the other relates to us as a god, as Spinoza says. That two working together in fellowship is greater than three working alone, or even greater than three working together in cruelty. We've all tasted some of the truth and evidence that this affect makes manifest to us. The evidence, the truth of agape, right? Of this loving charity, of jada in Hebrew, or what we do out of love for the perfection of others, guided by reason, which is what Spinoza calls piety. And this notion is extremely simple and known to everyone, and we yet collectively fail to follow it because the affect has not been properly developed. It is in a weak form. In the face of other present pleasures, this sort of hypothetical idea, we have this suggestion in our mind that working to make myself agree with others is my greatest virtue and utility, and that working together and being generous is the best way forward. And yet, people take advantage of each other. They emotionally manipulate each other. They disempower one another. They lie, deceive, and take advantage of each other. Even when we all know in our heart that the only acceptable option is a world of sincere and generous collaboration, where we work to perfect each other and the human condition, we are nevertheless forced to imagine this as a future possibility in which we might enjoy this kind of state, in which we have these types of relations in community. This is only an image, and it's easily driven away by others that promise a joy that we can reliably turn to and consume. We find a sort of satisfaction in these nearer and more immediate gratifications. But our reason, our ratio, our sense of moderation and balance persistently cautions against grabbing the closer and more immediate gratification. And when we consistently get away with indulging in the immediate, we form an addictive attachment with its own momentum that is difficult to break, and that keeps us in bondage. And when we form various addictive attachments, they can often be at odds with each other, even though they are all, we might say, species of the same sort of desire. They both are seeking pleasure, but they contradict one another. And Spinoza gives the example of drunkenness and avarice. Avarice is greed. So the drunk ends up spending all their money, and so these two addictive attachments, although they are related species of affect, are actually at odds with one another and dissipate our power. It's conceivable that in a given society, the active affects of piety and generosity would be naturally strengthened in childhood and education to the point where everyone would express virtue and desire philosophical friendships above all else. But it's equally as evident that in this case, an immediate perception of nearly everyone around us, and in our own lives, that this truth, while always there, can be snuffed out in terms of how it affects our action. And this happens quite easily when other emotions hold sway through projecting a perceived good that is the product of our mutilated ideas and allowed to gain momentum through repeatedly receiving passive joys, through certain antisocial affects like envy when we're joyful at someone else's demise or their pain. It is only because we are assailed by antisocial affects, and insofar as we live in a social context that fosters these antisocial affects, and arguably every human society would have these to some degree. Every human at some point is angry and acts foolishly, right? Irrationally towards others. And growing up is about learning to stop doing that. A society with lots of superstition and hatred and bigotry has a mutilated social affect, and within that we lose our footing, and we wind up spending all of our effort on activities that diminish our own power and that of those around us, and limit our scope of potential compositions, limit our ability to see things differently. Now, the perspective of intuition, built by Spinoza, does not leave behind our imagination and its affects, nor rationality, although it stands alongside them and in a sense corrects them. You could say that we perceive a ratio in musical harmony, and we can measure that rationally, and then we can have an intuitive grasp of that the essence of the composition of the relation as such. The ratio of motion and rest is the living activity of the body. It is also the measuring of itself and the tuning of itself. And here, of course, we will have both an objective and a formal reality. And the formal reality is the idea that it knows how to tune itself. It is the self-awareness and affirmation of the essence as a free expression of that power and virtue. Thus, we are going to have to see things in our imagination, in our reason, and in the essence through intuition. We still have the bodies and bumping into each other and tuning and harmonizing with each other, limiting one another, and we still see our existence, our actual essence, as concerning, as distressing, right? We are finite and fragile. We will conceive our existence as under threat, even as we see the greater part of ourselves as eternal. Our eternal self, from a certain perspective, is impersonal. The impersonal dimension of Spinoza himself and the ethics can be seen in the very generosity of his mind, which enables us to be like him. It's almost a kind of tender impersonality, right? Or a personable, impersonal consciousness. That we participate in this impersonal without it being against something tender and personal. It is that we think an idea by that idea thinking itself through us. We are not producing something subjectively in our minds, but instead participating in the idea. Or rather, the idea thinks itself in us. And, when we follow Spinoza and participate in the ideas of the ethics, it's actually that he is constructing in us certain ideas, and we are in a sort of absolute intimacy with him in these ideas, and that is because they are in God, and we have that intimacy in God. We don't think his mind, and we don't think himself in our mind, like he doesn't think himself in our mind. Instead, we open ourselves to these ideas, and they think themselves in us in the same way that they think themselves in him. And this is extremely profound, has a profound implication with the fact that this is absolutely transformative, that these operations of the mind, when we think these ideas and when we affirm these eternal necessities, they change us, they transform and transvalue us. Now, we do not become Spinoza, which is exactly to the point. We become in our own way, and we individuate through this generosity and freedom that Spinoza has opened us to, that he has expressed in his own one singular way, which is the ethics. Spinoza could not tell us at the beginning of the ethics that our minds could participate in the infinite immediate mode, and that they are like attributes, eternal necessity. He could not tell us that our being as modes and not substance was really inconsequential in the face of our essence, and that we are not just a determination of some prior cause meaninglessly bumped around, that our essence expresses something that is not bumped around in space and time and conceived through the intellect as finite, that our existence as singular beings, while neither substantial nor conceived through itself alone, while necessarily being conceived through God's power and through nature, that in addition to all of that, there is something that is conceived through itself, which is our singular essence. And he could not tell us these things at the beginning of the ethics because we weren't ready to hear them. We had to hear them in their proper place and through the transformation of concepts from parts 1 and 2 into 3 and 4 and 5. Certain concepts are both the same and different and need to be seen in their proper evolution. God or nature, essence or power, which also is virtue and conatus and desire and perfection. Ultimately, we need to see all of these things as unique perspectives, but also one reality. Our perfection is an action, and our action relates to the affordances in our world, and ultimately, it depends on the state in which we live, on the relation that we have with others, and on the way that we work together and think together and generously empower one another. And this necessarily will develop our biological, ecological, zoological selves and compose them in ways that Spinoza only glimpsed obliquely. Spinoza saw that we needed an organic and ecological conception of affects in the body and in community, and thus an ecological sense of the state, of how we empower each other and work collectively and thus depend on one another. And this same organic approach applies at the level of our affects, of our imagination, and as we progressively orchestrate our movements and rests to be harmoniously together and compose joyful affects. Freedom is collective, and the highest acts of freedom benefit not only the individual, but its political ecosystem, as it expresses its highest power and virtue. It does not drain resources from its system. The free person draws more from themselves than they contain, draws more from what they take from the system, and feeds back more into that system than it takes out. This means that it expresses greater reality. By interrupting and decreasing any forms of force or energy or power that detract and disempower those in their community, and also even to the work of mitigating violence in community. And this is rather an empowerment done through empowering people, not by removing their power, making people act out of love and care and piety rather than hate, coming to feel pleasure only when others have proper pleasures, and pain when they have their proper pains. This is the opposite of envy, right? If there's a dysfunction and an antisocial relation of affects when I feel pleasure when you feel pain, and vice versa, when I feel pain when you feel pleasure. In this case, our affects do not compose with each other. They dissolve and are antagonistic to one another. And hate, according to Spinoza, is a purely antisocial affect and cannot be used to form a state, cannot be the motivating factor of free and democratic society. And hate cannot extinguish hate. Only love can, and not by removing someone's power, but by further empowering them to overcome hatred in themselves. We must strengthen each other through knowledge and through virtue to express our unique powers of ourselves, and not to foster violent hatred or envy, and not to work according to the appetites, and not according to the strategy of weakness spreading weakness. And this is where Spinoza starts part 4. The first proposition: nothing positive that a false idea has is taken away by the presence of the true, insofar as it is true. So this refers to the fact that even our most mutilated ideas still have some reality to them. Even our most absurd fantasies are still rooted in existence and reality to some degree. And, as a conatus, we always have some self-awareness of our own existence, our own enduring, and the virtue that is. So nothing positive in a false idea. That is all of that content. The parts that are real and right, that are then distorted and mutilated. So in the presence of a true idea, everything that was true in the false idea will still be there. And everything that was positive and that could become a true idea is retained and resonated and strengthened. So, whatever positive reality there is in our antisocial affects and in our dysfunctional way of relating to each other, when we come to have empowering ideas, all of the positive content will be preserved and augmented. And Proposition 2 states that, we are modes. We are acted on by other things. There is ways in which we cannot be conceived other than by being acted on by other things and by being a part of nature. And insofar as we see this part of ourself from this vantage and this explanation, Proposition 3 holds the force by which a human being perseveres in existing is limited and is infinitely surpassed by the power of external causes. And what he says in Proposition 4, that it's impossible that we be completely self-determined, that we be only the adequate cause. The human being is a part of nature and must undergo changes, and is not understood solely through its own nature. And in the corollary, he says that it follows from this that human beings always necessarily are subject to passions, and that they follow the common order of nature and obey it. And that means they are constantly adapting themselves to the nature of things, as is required by the nature of things. And our passions cannot be understood through our own essence alone. They are understood through the composition of our essence with other essences that either hinder or enhance our essence. So, in a way, our passions colonize our psyche. They take up residency there, they come from outside, and they have a force by which they occupy our mind and are stubborn. And in Proposition 6, he says, the force of any passion or emotion can so surpass all the other actions or powers of a person that the emotion stubbornly stays with her. The strength, intensity, and persistence of emotions is the main topic and perspective that the chapter takes. What we need to do is restrain and take away certain emotions, and this can only happen when there is a stronger emotion that restrains it and supplants it. We are already occupied by, colonized by emotions that are antisocial and disempowering and mutilating. Now, something that we see in part 4 of the text is a shift from a kind of external categorization and cataloging of certain facts about God and human beings and emotions to the position of a person who has a certain set of values and is working towards something in life and through action, motivated by different emotions and attempting to organize their life. The mind can be empowered if we decolonize it from these violent emotions and antisocial affects. We have to disenthrall our minds, as Lincoln said. In the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln says that we cannot escape history. And Lincoln was highlighting the judgment by which later generations would look back at them and judge the power and perfection of their action. And he conceived this through a sort of necessity by which, you could say, the law of the appetites becomes a tyrannical principle. And this is what he says. But it's by the dictates of reason that we cannot sit back and allow this tyrannical principle to increase its power through violence. And if we do nothing, we will eventually not just be looked back at poorly, we will be annihilated by the war instinct. We cannot escape history in that sense either. And we must counter the war instinct and abolish war ultimately. Only through intellectual generosity and the power of reason can we save ourselves, can we disenthrall our minds and save this republic, as he says. Lincoln has some overtly Spinozan traits, despite there being no direct link of influence. There is the indirect link, which is Euclid. Both studied Euclid religiously, you might say. And Lincoln, memorizing certain passages and the definitions and things of that nature. And he said that he learned what demonstration really meant when he read Euclid. Now, because Lincoln was somewhat Euclidean in his metaphysical psychology, in what he thinks through the political, his standard for truth and in the confidence in the power of spirit and reason was the political practice that he adopted. In many ways, this is consonant with the Spinozan politics. When he says that we must disenthrall ourselves, he is Spinozistic. When he says that we cannot escape history and that it's now, in this moment, that we must act with resolve and with heart and mind in harmony with reason. Freedom is this disenthralling activity and uses the light of nature, we could say, or the common order of things, the ratio behind them. We must do something now because we can't escape the consequences of our actions, and we will destroy ourselves or the future, and we are unable to outrun history unless we stop vicious and cruel attempt to gain power through dominating each other with violence, exploitation, and extraction. We will perish from the earth. We will destroy ourselves if we do not stop. We will end up so depraved and abject that we kill each other, total annihilation. This is the necessary consequence of the law of the appetites, and only by being disenthralled from its domination can we manage to endure at all. And only by preserving democracy can we hope to delay, forestall, and disarm this annihilation. In this respect, Spinoza's political philosophy is the greatest, most accomplished effort to plan ahead. He has planned so far ahead for something still yet to come, and yet which his text still appears to have the power to bring us closer to and better conceive and imagine. Lincoln saw and planned ahead for a similar vision of the world. Just as Euclid made something that we can still use today, something that actually causes us to have certain ideas, right? We have the idea of the triangle following Euclid. And, even after non-Euclidean mathematics still have their own regional purview and truth to them. So Spinoza also can train us to philosophize in a certain way that follows the natural grain of our mind and things. And we can sort of feed off of him through the appetites of our mind, if you will, and grow our intentionality and our thought processes and our intelligence in ways that we've never imagined and ways that he never imagined. This is just what Schelling saw in Spinocism, that it is, in a certain perspective, fated to become something static, a kind of relic of this absolute objectification that Spinoza performed, his singular life, bringing together everything that he thought and trying to create an integral view of it, a complete system. And since we cannot be Spinoza and we cannot occupy the adequate idea that thought all of his system when he made it, his systematized edifice in the ethics is highly particular and, in a way, only fits perfectly to his integral of experience. That's what Schelling says. And yet it can attune us to certain essences in the infinite intellect and thereby empowers us with the same intellectual generosity that animated his life and philosophy. So perhaps the ethics could have a short subtitle, not unlike the second part, and say only, how to disenthrall the mind, amend it, and make everyone most useful to each other. This would anticipate what is to come in parts 4 and 5, and shows the purpose of the whole book, which is the disenthrallment and amending of the mind, such that we become useful to each other. And this is perhaps both overstating and understating what the text accomplishes. It understates because utility is only part of it. We become most pleasurable, most loved, most generous to each other. And it is our greatest blessedness that this ultimately bestows, a life of glory and cheerfulness. It also overstates in the fact that, despite its many virtues, it has not actually succeeded to bring to fruition on the face of the earth a society worthy of Spinoza's notions of piety and generosity. And while Spinoza has always had followers and people interested in his work, and he has vast influence across the history of philosophy and often in ways that is not explicit, we can hardly say that this text has made the general population of people, more virtuous and put them on a path of virtue. It has and continues to do so only in very small pockets of the world. We are only narrowly escaping complete catastrophe in our political structures, and only a complete disenthrallment can save us. We must be led by the hand through these proofs, and we should study one or two of the proofs of Euclid and find the evidence that is the basis of all of our thinking. After reflecting on the mind's activity in the process of thinking geometrically, we have self-evidence of a criteria of truth that will prove indispensable in making sense of what follows. The lesson of geometry is that all mental emendation, whenever the mind comes to know itself and amend itself, improve itself, we become inundated by the reasonableness and the glory of possessing these intellectual virtues and of intellectual generosity. The fact that our mental virtues are not scarce but shareable. We gain in mental fortitude. The intensity of our spiritedness and our sense of vocation increase. Without this assumption, without this aspect of Spinoza's own life, his own impetus as a philosopher, without the whole operative intelligence that was devoting itself to cultivating philosophical character, and which sought the greatest blessedness and joy, which affirmed this life project and committed itself to it, without the finality and work activity and operative intelligence and, we could say, purposiveness of the idea of perfecting ourselves. Without that, Spinoza would not make the Ethics, and Part 4 would not make any sense. It is the product of Spinoza's philosophical life. Without the idea, which cannot itself be an object of knowledge, which cannot be proven in the demonstrations, and which cannot be uttered, which cannot be written. This ineffable form of the idea of the idea, which is not a content of our experience. It's not an objective reality. It is a latent or operative intelligence that is irreducible to its conceptions, to the articulation of it in a definition, or its existence. It is what I would almost call a virtuality that subsists and backgrounds the actualizations. In a way, our essence is latent intelligibility. It is like the essence of a triangle, which when we conceive any particular triangle, remains, unexhausted by that particular triangle. There are an infinite number of other triangles that would also be contained within that idea. And the operative intelligence, the idea of the idea, the formal reality of an idea, is not, again, a content of our ideas, but is the act of having those ideas, the act of affirming them. So one of the core activities of free people living in a philosophical community is finding common notions. Common notions are useful ways of organizing things that have similarity. The first common notion of Euclid is that things which are equal to another thing are also equal to each other. And another common notion that might be Euclid's or just attributed to him later is the whole is greater than the part. We could think of these as conceptual consistencies that we find in the world. And the physical digression in Book 2, which has all of the lemata and postulates and all of these axioms about the movement and organization of bodies, is the common notions needed to describe living activity, organic activity. And the organic body is perceiving many things and doing many things. And for example, the human body is composed of a very large number of individual things of diverse nature, and therefore can be affected in many ways by one and the same body. So we're not only perceiving many things, but many things are perceived in many ways. And we may perceive the same thing differently at different times, and different people may be differently affected by one and the same object, and one and the same person may be differently affected at different times by one and the same object in Part 3, Proposition 51. And Part 3, Proposition 57 says that every emotion differs from another's emotion as much as the essence of one individual differs from the essence of another. And as Postulate 3 of Part 2 says, the individual things that compose the human body are consequently the human body itself and are affected by external bodies in very many ways. And while this is all a merely rational account of what is common, this common knowledge is quite useful to us. Now, it does not explain our individual expression of essence, but it can inform our individuation and the way that we express our essence in the context of life. Now, Lemata 7 says, a composite individual thing retains its nature, whether it moves as a whole or remains at rest, or moves in this direction or that, provided that each individual part retains its own motion and communicates it to the rest as before. And similarly in Lemata 5, that the parts composing individual things can become bigger or smaller, but in such proportion that they all keep the same ratio of motion and rest with respect to each as they had before. The individual likewise will retain the nature it had before without any change of form. And here we can think of a child becoming larger as they mature into adulthood. Now, this tendency to maintain something's nature through its composition, this already points us towards Part 3 and the conatus. And here we can see that it's understood compositionally. He says in the Scholium to Lemata 7, if we conceive another thing which is composed of several individual things of different natures, we shall find that it can be affected in quite a few other ways while still retaining its own nature. For each part of it is composed of several bodies. Each part of it will be able to move more swiftly or more slowly without any change of the nature itself, and consequently, it will be able to communicate its movements to other things more swiftly or more slowly. If we conceive further of a third kind of individual thing, which is composed of individual things of this second kind, we shall find that it can be affected in many ways without any change to its form. And if we continue like this ad infinitum, we shall easily conceive that the whole of nature is one individual thing, whose parts, that is, all bodies, vary in an infinite number of ways without any change to the whole individual. If I was planning to offer a formal discussion of body, I would have had to explain and prove these things more extensively. But as I have just now had a different aim, I only introduced these things because it can easily be used to deduce the other things. So Spinoza is saying that he has given this in the order that he has in order to prove what we see later in Part 4 about how the conatus can compose its affects and can compose itself affectively with other konati, and not for the sake of some kind of cosmological view about how we ecologically fit into the rest of nature, but in order to demonstrate all those things he has to say in part 4 about how to live. So this whole physical digression, which is really more of a physiological or an organic digression, ends with proposition 14 that states, the human mind is capable of perceiving very many things, and it is more capable of doing so the more ways its body can be disposed. And because in proposition 51 of part 4, people are differently affected by one and the same object, one and the same person may be differently affected at different times by one and the same object, we are often at odds with ourselves in our emotions. And since this is the case for all of us, we are all at odds not only with ourselves, but also with each other at different times. We are often mistakenly affected. We feel fear or anger when we shouldn't. Or we don't feel fear or anger when we should. And with this autopoetic, sum-poetic view of essences and how they can compose, we have part 4, proposition 20. The more each person endeavors to pursue what is useful to themselves, i.e. to preserve their being, and is able to do so, the more they will be endowed with virtue. And conversely, insofar as each person neglects what is useful for themselves, they neglect to preserve their own being. To that extent, they are powerless. And proposition 21, no one can desire to be blessed, to act well, or to live well, if they do not at the same time desire to be, to act, and to live, i.e., to actually exist. And proposition 22, no virtue can be conceived prior to this one, i.e., the endeavor to persevere in existing. And the corollary is that to endeavor to persevere itself is the first and only foundation of virtue, for nothing else can be conceived as prior to this principle, and no virtue can be conceived without it. Now, since Spinoza understands virtue as equivalent to power and also to perfection, and we see that perfection, from our perspective, always involves a judgment of good and bad, better and worse. When we act intending some goal, we necessarily have a sense of the perfectibility of the process, that the actions are leading towards a culmination and perfection. Now, from the perspective of reason and our action, and in a way, from the perspective of essences and power, we will come to judge as good only those things that increase our power and utility, and bad are those that decrease and hinder. And from this perspective, knowledge and fellowship are the best things of all, and there are various other things that are conducive to these, and they are lesser realities, lesser perfections, lesser values, lesser goods. So part 4, proposition 16 says, a desire arising from true cognition of good and bad, insofar as this cognition looks to the future, can be quite easily restrained or extinguished by a desire for things that are pleasant in the present. Now, in the same way that envy played a central role in part 3 of the ethics, looking at how our affects get stuck in this kind of whirlpool, here we similarly have a predicament where basically we know what's better and yet we choose the worse. So the desires that arise from reason and from adequate knowledge of things and through the essence, that can be extinguished by a desire for a pleasure that is immediate. So again, there's a kind of escape velocity here where we become trapped, right, in servitude to these colonizing emotions that have taken over and that we cannot simply will ourselves out of. We have to build a path out of them. We have to counter them with other emotions that are stronger and capable of restraining them. And this will, of course, come from our joy, from our own strength, from an awareness of our own strength. And he says in Proposition 18, a desire that arises from joy, all things being equal, is stronger than a desire that arises from sadness. Now this is a kind of paradoxical notion, because he's saying if the joy and sadness were equal to each other, then the joy would be stronger. And so what he's saying is that the desire as determined by joy and sadness, the joy is always stronger than the comparative desire. Perhaps we could say there will always be more perfection and reality in joy than there will be in sadness. And not only is there more reality in joy, there's more reality still in action. And Proposition 24 says, to act from virtue absolutely is nothing else in us than to act, to live, to persevere in one's being. These three signify the same thing. By the command of reason and on the foundation of pursuing what is useful for oneself. So virtue is born from a foundation of a kind of rational endeavoring and a sense of the usefulness of oneself and of one's own existence. And from this we learn in Proposition 27 that we know nothing to be either good or bad with certainty, but that which in truth contributes to understanding is good, or that which hinders us from understanding, which is bad. And above and beyond that, the highest good of the mind is cognition of God, and the highest virtue of the mind is to know God, Proposition 28. And from this proposition, through the next handful of propositions, Spinoza builds on the idea of things that are in agreement with us, things that are in common with our nature, and how ultimately, since we are in God and derive our power from God, and have something in common with God in that sense, also have something in common with other people, and insofar as we can find what we have that agrees, we can draw more out of each other. We can resonate our powers in a way that aids us in our project of escaping from servitude to the passions. Only insofar as humans follow the dictates of reason, follow the commands of reason, follow the voice of reason, the calling of what is rational, what is moderated, what is balanced, they necessarily can find ways to agree. And when they act from the commands of reason, when they follow reason, they will agree. This is what he says in Proposition 35, and in the corollary he says, there is no particular thing in nature that is more useful to a human being than a human being who lives by the command of reason. For the thing most useful to a human being is something that is most nearly agrees with his own nature. And, as is self-evident, this is another human being. A human being acts by the laws of her own nature absolutely when she lives by the commands of reason. And to that extent does she necessarily agree with the nature of another human being. Therefore, all particular things, there is nothing more useful to a human being than another human being. And the next corollary. When, more than anything, everyone pursues what is useful to themselves, then human beings are useful to each other more than anything. The more each human being pursues what is useful to themselves and endeavors to persevere in themselves, the more they are endowed with virtue, and what is the same thing? The greater the power is possessed for acting by the laws of their own nature, for living by the command of reason. But human beings most agree in nature when they live by the command of reason. Therefore, human beings will be most useful to each other when each most pursues what is useful to them. And thus, crowning this whole movement of the text in part 4, Proposition 36 says, the highest good of those who follow after virtue is common to all, and all can equally enjoy it. And again, in Proposition 37, the good that everyone who follows after virtue wants for themselves, they will also desire for others, and all the more, the greater the cognition they have of God. The more that we love what is good for us in community with each other and through the knowledge of God, maximally intensifies all of these desires, and they will quickly become capable of overpowering the other emotions. Reason thus attunes us to new power vectors, new ways of composing and orchestrating concerted movements and concerted affects in ourselves and with others. And in the second scholium to Proposition 37, he adds a discussion of natural and civil state of the human being. I'll read the whole passage. Every person exists by the highest right of nature, and consequently by the highest right of nature, every person does the actions that follow from the necessity of her own nature. Therefore, by the highest right of nature, every person judges what is good and what is bad. She looks to what is useful for herself in conformity with her own character, and avenges herself. And she endeavors to preserve what she loves and destroy what she hates. But if people live by the command of reason, each person would hold this right of hers without injury to other people. But human beings are subject to emotions that far surpass human power or virtue. Therefore, they are often drawn in different directions and are contrary to each other, so long as they lack mutual assistance. Therefore, so that human beings may live in harmony and assist each other, it is necessary that they give up their own natural right and give each other assurance that they will do nothing that may cause injury to another, the means by which it may be brought about that human beings, who are necessarily subject to emotions and who are inconstant and variable, may be able to give each other assurance and have trust in each other. No emotion can be restrained except by another emotion that is stronger and contrary to the emotion that needs to be restrained. And everyone refrains from inflicting injury through fear of greater injury. The only condition, therefore, under which society can be firmly established is if it takes to itself the right which every person has of avenging themselves and making judgments about good and bad, and if it thus has the ability to prescribe a common way of life and to make laws and to reinforce them, not with reason, which cannot restrain the emotions, but with threats. Such a society, reinforced by laws and by the ability to preserve itself, is called a commonwealth, and those who are protected by its right are called citizens. We easily understand from all of this that there is nothing in the state of nature that is good or bad by the consent of all, since everyone in the state of nature looks only to what is useful for themselves and decides what is good and bad in conformance with their own character, thinking only of what is useful for themselves, and is not bound by any law to obey anyone except themselves, and therefore, in the state of nature, sin cannot be conceived. But it can be conceived in the civil state, where good and bad are decided by common consent, and everyone is bound to obey the commonwealth. Sin, therefore, is nothing but disobedience, and for this reason it is punished solely by the right of the commonwealth. Conversely, obedience is regarded as merit in a citizen, because it is only because of this that they are judged worthy to enjoy the advantages of the commonwealth. Pausing for a second and explaining that a little bit, he's saying that if you murder other citizens, you are not capable of being in the commonwealth. And when you have obedience to that, what you get is to live in a society where people don't kill each other. Okay, continuing the passage. Then, in the state of nature, no one is owner of anything by common consent, and there is nothing in nature that can be said to belong to this person or that person, but everything belongs to everybody. Accordingly, in the state of nature, the will of rendering to each what is his cannot be conceived, nor that of stealing from anyone what belongs to them. In the state of nature, nothing is done that can be said to be just or unjust, but only in the civil state, where it is decided by common consent what belongs to this person or that. It is apparent from all this that justice and injustice, sin and merit, are extrinsic notions and not attributes which explain the nature of the mind. What Spinoza has established here is generally just that a civil society is oriented towards the preservation of the individuals in the society. And this is only rational and just and things like that if it is actually doing what we are consenting to, right? It's only by the constituent consent that the right of a commonwealth can come into power. And from here, Spinoza jumps immediately back into the discussion developed from the physical or organismic digression and brings in the idea of how the parts can be preserved in their proportion of motion and rest, such that the human body preserves its form, even though it undergoes certain changes, perhaps in intensity. The proportion of the parts need to remain the same. And being affected in many ways ends up that the more ways we can be affected allows for a more balanced way of being affected that doesn't decrease our power and is not harmful. And then Spinoza quickly connects this back to something concerning society and civil society. He says in Proposition 40, things that promote a common society of human beings, or which ensure that human beings live in concord, are useful. Those, conversely, that bring discord into a commonwealth are bad. So Spinoza is now operating under the assertion that reason demands we live in a commonwealth and that we consent to the laws of the commonwealth. And this is really nothing but the desire to promote society and the desire to empower each other in community. That we not contradict the basic things about how we can agree with each other. You cannot live in hatred with one another and actually be happy. You will always end up in sadness and in strife. Envy and superstition, these will always cause humans to be at variance with each other and to suffer. So here, the notions of good and of perfection and of reason are all very closely sort of co-determining each other in relation to the kanatos, or rather in the relation between a multiplicity of kanati. Nothing can be good or perfect that hinders, diminishes, or threatens existence. Nothing that the Commonwealth does as a Commonwealth is hurting or jeopardizing the security of the citizens. Common society does not restrict humans, it enables them, it empowers them. When we have all of our powers in the state of nature, we are at a lower overall intensity. A commonwealth promotes both our power and our reason, and so there's a kind of triadic structure of reinforcing each other. The conatus commands reason, reason commands the commonwealth, and the commonwealth commands the conatus. And each of these is a virtue, is a certain power, and they resonate with each other and act in concert. Now, at this point in part 4, around Proposition 41, things start to shift, and we begin a discussion of emotions, and this is very much parallels a lot of the discourse in part 3, and I'm going to make a separate video that goes into that as well as the appendix. And we'll look at how the emotions connect together from part 3 and part 4 and part 5, and where the pattern of emotions leaves behind our servitude, enters into the community of rational beings, and generates generous intelligence, creates things that help us all think more and empowers us in our thought. Our mind on intellectual generosity is drunk with the love of God and the love of the power of the mind. And this is, of course, also a love of the body, when the body has its rational powers, its harmonies and proportionate consonants. So just to recap, the power of the emotions is, of course, a power to keep us in servitude through the momentum that emotions have, and that habit keeps us trapped in certain patterns. But also, the strength of the emotions is the exit velocity that takes us out of that inertial state of servitude to the emotions. And above all, this power of our ability to escape is collective, is dependent on our relation with others, has to do with the state we live in, the way that we promote virtue in each other.